My name is Peter Winstanley. I'm a retired citizen soldier. I retired as a Lieutenant Colonel from the Army Reserve back in 1994, and I've developed a deep interest in the events involving the Australian prisoners of war of the Japanese during the Second World War. Today I have the opportunity of interviewing Roy Whitecross. Roy was on the staff of 8th Division Headquarters in Singapore. Later he formed part of a party of 3,000 to go to Burma. This group was called A-Force, and Roy went up there and worked on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, and still later he was sent to Japan to slave in the coal mines at Omuta Camp 17 in southern Japan. I will now pass over and do my interview with Roy. Roy, thank you very much for your agreeing to this talk today, and particularly so that you've gone to the trouble of coming into the city to do it.
Well, it was very difficult for you from Perth to get your way out to my suburb.
Yeah.
Be trains and buses and all sorts of things, whereas I can do it quite relatively easy.
And maybe we could start by, if you can tell us your date of birth, where you went to school, where you went to high school, and whether you joined the militia or whether you went straight into the AIF.
Well, I was born on the 7th of April 1920, so that in a week or two's time I shall be 87. I was born in Sydney, in Randwick as a matter of fact. My aunt was the matron of a private hospital in Randwick, and I was born there, and we lived in those days in Stanmore. Before the war, my brother and I both joined the militia. We were both keen on horses, so we joined the cavalry, and the cavalry unit that we went into was the 4th Cavalry Field Ambulance. Now that was very good for later times because we did a lot of medical work. Once a month we had to go on a Saturday night, because that was the busy night, to the Royal South Sydney Hospital, and that was in the days of the razor gangs, and we would get razor gangs. Well, what the razor gang did to somebody.
Their victims.
Their victims.
Mm-hmm.
The first night, I always remember, it was a shock to my system, being brought up in a comfortable area. I walked into the casualty room, and there was a chap with his arm sitting up, and it was gashed to the bone from wrist to elbow, and they had forceps hanging on it while they stitched up inside. And apparently I must have shown that I was a bit shocked by this, because one of the nurses said to me, "Come and sit over here," she said, "there's a fan going." But I sat there for a minute or two and I thought, this is no good, you know, so I got up, and then it was and then he went into shock, so they had to admit him to the hospital, and all those people were entered into a book, and so I got his name. I was told, being the junior peanut, I was told to enter him up, his name and his address and cause of injury. And he had told us, not once but unending, he had tripped over a pitchfork, and we learned who owned the pitchfork, who used the pitchfork, why it was left there, how he tripped over it, and then all again over this pitchfork. And so, cause of injury. And I looked at the doctor and I said, even I know that'd be a puncture wound, not a great slash. I said, what do I put down? He said, put down, fell over pitchfork. I put that down. And later on, I said to him, tell me, that was absolutely ridiculous. Why did we continue with this? And he said, look, he said, you don't understand this part of the world. He said, this is razor gang work. He said, and if we get a razor case or a bashing by a group, we've got to inform the police. And he said, if we had informed the police about that chap's, that it was a razor gang, he said he wouldn't have lasted a week, because the gang would have thought that he had put them into the police and they would have got him. So he said, that's what we do. And the only other one that we had later on, he'd been attacked up in Redfern, and he had, they didn't get his eyes, whether that was deliberate or his lips, but he had slashes all over his face. And he was, unfortunately, he passed out on the footpath up in Redfern, and somebody had called the ambulance, and so in he came, and that was a razor gang thing. We'd had to go down as a razor gang, and the doctor said to me, well, you know, I hope he can convince them that he didn't put them in.
Yes.
So it was an interesting time, and we also went into the School of Anatomy at the university, and again once a month, where they produce a cadaver from the bath of formalin, and he had been dissected. Half his ribs had been taken out, and all his internal organs were there. And what we were taught to do was to say, like, a spleen goes in here, and your liver goes in here, so that if we ever, this was 1935, 36, war wasn't really thought about it in those days, but they said, if in the case of going into action and you get a wounded soldier who's got a gunshot wound here or there, you would know what was underneath there. And so that was good. And then I applied to join the Air Force, and at that time they had a problem with their numbers had got out of kilter with air crew and ground staff, and I was put on the reserve. And then I was in the militia with a 3-month camp now, because war was not only near us, it was on us. And I was in camp at militia camp at Walgrove, and I got a telephone call from the Undersecretary of Premier's Department, because I was a public servant in those days. And he said, have you ever thought about joining the forces? And I said, don't be silly. I said, I've been on the reserve list for the Air Force for months. And I said, so that's, you know, do I want to get into the military? And he said, well, what about the army? I said, yes, anything to get into the, I said, it'll be all over before I can get into it.
Yeah.
And he said, well, there's a place that they want somebody with your qualifications, and I was a shorthand writer and typist. You had to be in those days, particularly if you were on the Premier's personal staff. He said, there's a place there. He said, come in and see Colonel Rourke at, and it's the headquarters of 8th Div. So I came down and joined the army with headquarters 8th Division. And we went, that was on the 3rd of March, 1941, 41. And we went away to Singapore on the Boissevain, a Dutch luxury liner. And there was only a few of us. There was about 3 advance parties that went to Singapore. We were an advance party, a small group of us, and my mate and I had a first-class two-berth cabin, and oh, that was a wonderful trip.
Now, were you on 8th Div headquarters at that stage?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
No, that was the only unit I was in that, and I was kept in it the whole time.
Yes. What date would you have arrived in Singapore?
It'd be the end of April.
Yeah. So you actually had nearly 8 months before
No,
the Japs invaded? Because you
No,
were there in April and they invaded in December.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
I see what you mean. Yes.
Yeah. So where were you? Was the divisional headquarters located over that period of time?
We were located at a suburb called Sentul, Sentul, which is a suburb 2 or 3 miles out of Kuala Lumpur. So we were actually in Kuala Lumpur
Yes.
for that time, and then the Supreme Command reallocated all sorts of things, and the AIF was given the state of Johor to protect it. And at that point, which would be around about Christmas time, we went down to Johor Bahru and took over an old building that had been the palace of the Prime Minister to the Sultan of Johor, and we took that over as divisional headquarters.
Now, was General Bennett with you the whole time?
Oh yes, I was working closely
Yeah,
under General
yeah,
Bennett
Yeah.
and the G1 Colonel Thayer.
Yes.
See, I was in G section, which is operations.
Operations. Yeah.
And that was very interesting because I knew exactly what was going on everywhere, but I didn't see it until much later, after the war, 2 or 3 years after the war. The Australian High Commissioner in Singapore invited, at our expense, to come over for the Anzac Day service at Kranji Cemetery. And after that, we had a coach which took us to all our battle stations, and I, for the first time, saw Muar and Parrot Soolong and Mersing and Jamelawang, the whole places that, well, I'd been in Jamelawang because I was sent up there with a group. They called it a report centre, which beats me. I was getting messages from the front line, which in the early days of the war were 300 miles away, and I then set them up in a cipher, gave them to the signal detachment that was with us at Jamelawang, and they sent it to Singapore headquarters. Why they couldn't send it direct from the front line to Singapore, why?
Yeah.
The High Command sometimes is very difficult to understand.
I appreciate that. Do you remember there was an unusual arrangement where two particular units were raised for the Brits? They were corps troops, and they were the 2nd 3rd MAC, Motor Ambulance Convoy, and the Reserve Motor Transport Company. Do you ever remember them coming in?
Yes, we knew about them, and as they were only going to be ambulance drivers, the age limit was extended for them, and they were sent up to right onto the border between Thailand and Siam, as it was in those days. But the Japs landed actually behind them at Kota Bahru. So they were, all they did was to help out as much as they could and race down with the advancing, or our retiring troops and the advancing Japs.
Yeah, and I understand they did a marvellous job.
They did a wonderful job under very difficult circumstances because the See, that's we're getting on to another thing, that the British had been there for 10 years, and General Percival had decided that the jungle was impenetrable. Absolutely impenetrable. Like a high brick wall, he put it one time. And so that it was absolutely impassable. And so that if the Japs came down by road and didn't attack Singapore from the sea, because, and this became pretty obvious, because they had taken over Siam right down to the border. And they knew there were thousands and thousands of Japanese troops there. So, and in Percival's idea, the only way down the Malay Peninsula was by road. There were 3 roads, north and south, and they had to come down by road because the jungle was impenetrable. And so he set up pillboxes on the roads, and when the fighting got near them, the Japanese, of course, as they came through villages, they just simply snatched push bikes from the local population, and they rode them down. And when the tyres blew out, they just continued to ride on the rims, and you could hear them on the bitumen road. You could hear them coming half a mile away, and there was always. It took us a long time, or it took the British a long time to realise this. There was always what we called a suicide squad, 20 or so men, out in front, pedalling down the road. And so, of course, they'd come under fire from the pillboxes, and they were wiped out. They all knew they were going to. Most of them didn't even. They tied their rifle to their bike. They didn't even have. They knew they were going to be killed. Yeah, one for the emperor.
Yeah. Before you go on, that early stage when you mentioned that the Allies were up on the border, the Indians, and then there was the Argylls and the Gordons were up there, and our MAC and our motor transport. That was an operation called Operation Matador. Did you know on divisional headquarters about Operation Matador?
Vaguely, but it was a British thing, and really had nothing to do with us, except in this tiny bit of the second, third MAC.
Yes.
So that sort of information was sort of disregarded.
And they weren't 8th Div units anyway, were they?
Well, they were attached to us.
Yeah.
They were
for administration. Yeah.
So that was the way it came.
Yeah.
But getting back to these pillboxes, of course, what they did, having wiped out the suicide squad, it indicated to the following thousands of Japs where our front line was. And the next thing the Japs in the pillbox knew, they were being attacked from the rear. The Japs had just melted into the jungle, came round, and the only thing they could do was to leap out of their pillbox, jump into a truck, and if they were lucky, they hurtled down the road, and most of them got back. But so much for the impenetrable jungle.
Yes, yeah. Now, do you remember roughly when you actually went across the causeway yourself, as you moved back into Singapore Island?
Yeah, I see, with operations and what they, well, let's put it this way, what we had done, or what the General had done, he had split headquarters into 2, and each man had an opposite number. And they were not all together, so that if a bombing raid, for example, wiped out one half, there was a divisional headquarters still operating with every man duplicated by another one.
Yes.
And in action, when we got into action, all of us were working anything of 16, 18 hours a day, day after day. in and out of rubber plantations, and typing up and duplicating movement orders, and that I was only 21, and that finally, from my medical training in the militia, I knew my nerves were going to pieces. And one of the systems there, my left hand, I had a thumb that wouldn't stop wiggling. And so I said to the officer on duty at the time, I said, I've got to be relieved. Send Merv Parkins up, he was my opposite number. He was down at, see, we had rear headquarters, advance headquarters, and where the general was, that was battle headquarters. There was only a few of us there, and that's why we worked such long hours. And I recognised that I was going to pieces, and this was dangerous because I would be typing up a movement order in the dark, pitch dark, weren't allowed a light because the Japs were usually so close. A light would be a death wish. So, and I recognised that with my nerves going to pieces, I could make a mistake in the map references. I could have a battalion going out here and their medical out there and their ammunition supplies somewhere else, and it was dangerous. So he said, he agreed with me. He said, I'll talk to the Colonel. And he came back and he said, no. He said, your request to be relieved is not granted. He said, the General thinks that this group that we have here is working very well together and he won't break it up. So a couple of days later, to put it short, I trapped another officer, and as he passed the tent that we were in a tent at the time, all camouflage, and I burst into a tirade against the Colonel. And because he dashed in and said, Whitecross, I heard what you said. He said, you can't get away with that. He said, you could be sent to a battalion or something. I said, right. I said, right. You tell me which, I said, all my gear's here. I said, give me 2 minutes and tell me which battalion and I'm off. I'm off. Oh, he said, oh. So away he went. Came back 10 minutes later and he said the Colonel has agreed that tonight nothing could move on the roads in the daytime because of the Japanese aircraft. He said tonight a truck will come up bringing Merv Parkins up and it'll take you back to headquarters. And that I fell onto the ground there and went fast asleep.
I'm just going to hold you there.
The interesting part of that was that when I woke up in the morning and I stepped out and there was the sky and the sun. I had been, of course, under the rubber trees for 3 or 4 weeks. Never saw the sun, never saw, always in, and I was a bit claustrophobic at that time, and that was the problem. That had sort of depressed me, I suppose you could put it. Yeah. And that, the next day I was as right as rain. And I thought, well, I knew I had made some English friends in Albury, and I thought, well, there's nothing to do here. Battle headquarters is doing all the work, of course. And I thought, tomorrow I'll take one of these bikes and I'll ride over and see how they're going. And that night I get a signal from battle headquarters to take a party onto Singapore Islands and set up advance headquarters. And so my trip to my friends was off, and so I got my 3-ton office truck and a group, and we over the causeway to Bukit Timah. And that's where very shortly after that, and the army had requisitioned a house, but when I got to this house, they gave me the address and everything else. Got to this house and I looked out and thought, there's somebody living there. So I went and knocked on the door, and a lady came with a tiny baby in her arms. And I said, haven't they told you that this house has been requisitioned by the army? I said, you shouldn't be here. I said, the whole place will be taken over either late today or tomorrow. I said, where's your husband? And she said, oh, he's joined the Malay volunteers, but he'll be back at midday. And I said, oh, well, all right. I said, I'll tell you what, I said, I can park my 3-ton office truck. There's a great big tree in their garden. I said, I can put it under there as camouflage, and just, you know, wish you the best, but we'll take over your house. And that's what happened. The general came down the next morning, but her husband came back about midday and got the shock of his life to see a 3-ton office truck in his garden. And so that became our headquarters for a while, until we had to move out of that down to, I think it was Hollands Road, which is another story which I find interesting. We had problems with the Malay civilians, and this has been denied by the University of Singapore. There's a professor there that has denied it vigorously, that there may have been a few Malays, but I would disagree with that violently. I think the Japanese had been busy in Malaya for years, under the very noses of the British. And so that, let's say, a vast majority, without putting a number on it, which is not possible, were pro-Japanese. And this is borne out in my mind by several facts. One of our officers was driving past a group of Malay houses, and they had clotheslines in front between the house and the road, and it was draped with red blankets and white sheets. And he thought, that's odd, because it was raining. Now why would you put them out in the rain? And then he realised that all the red blankets were in a line, and all the white sheets were in alternate lines each way. In other words, it made a perfect arrow. And so he went and took down all the, piled them on one of the houses, and then he went up 500 or 600 yards only in the direction that arrow had, and that was the headquarters of our artillery. And then there was another thing, the 22nd Brigade headquarters had pulled back, and they had carefully gone into a rubber estate. Now, rubber in those days was everywhere, and it was pure gold to the Malay. If you damaged a tree, the army had to pay the estate quite a sum of money. And to cut one down, that was a terrible sin, and the army had to pay a high price for that tree that was cut down. Unbelievable. It was so terrible. The 22nd Brigade headquarters had come off the road and had gone into a plantation, where, of course, all the trees, their foliage joined, you had perfect camouflage. But they hadn't been there for more than half an hour when a Japanese bomber came over and dropped a bomb straight into the very middle of the 22nd Brigade headquarters. And nobody could understand this until we were, a couple of days later, the 29th Brigade headquarters was in one corner of a large rubber plantation, and we, as battle headquarters, in the other corner. And a message had to be sent to the brigade headquarters, so one of our orderlies rode his bike down the road, along the road, back up the road to brigade headquarters, came back, very hot work at terrible temperatures, and shortly after that he was given another message to go back to 29th Brigade headquarters. And he worked out very sensibly that instead of the hot work of peddling a bike down, and he could cut straight through the plantation, no trouble, there's no undergrowth, they're all kept immaculately, these rubber plantations. He could walk straight through without much trouble and walk back in. So off he went, and 500 or 600 yards on his track, he stumbled upon an incredible scene. 12 trees had been cut down, stripped of their foliage, the logs laid end to end, and the foliage spread out to make an arrow exactly in line with our headquarters. And so he galloped back to the headquarters, and a platoon was sent on the double out there, and they got to work and they camouflaged this thing, and they were just finishing putting the bushes back to make it all look normal when over came, 20 minutes, and over came a bomber, and he circled and circled and circled, obviously looking for the ground to wear signal. And he even, at one stage, he pushed the canopy back and he was hanging out, searching the ground for what he had been told was a ground to wear signal for him,
yes,
where he could have hit that and counted 1, 2, 3, and the bomb would drop right into the middle of it.
yes.
There was even, on that theme, the luckiest thing that happened to the whole campaign. We moved down to Hollands Road. Divisional headquarters was in Hollands Road. Hollands Road in those days, I don't know about now, was a upper class district. Beautiful houses in extensive lawns up the whole place. It was decided by somebody that there would be a conference of General Bennett, who was there, General Percival from Fort Canning, and Field Marshal Wavell, who was on one of his very quick trips in and out of Singapore. Percival came up in a little staff car, sploshed with camouflage, sploshed green and yellow and whatnot. Dozens of them were running everywhere. Nobody took any notice of them. Wavell came up in what must have been the biggest, most luxurious car in Singapore. It was an enormous limousine, and it was black, polished to absolutely beautiful. And on the bonnet he flew a Union Jack, so big, and he had 2 outriders and cycles in front and 2 behind him, so that any half-witted person would know that that was a very, very important person. He arrived, our blokes took one look at this enormous car and started, they put a camouflage net, etc., over the top of it. 15 minutes later, 3 bombers came over. Now here's a street with the similar houses way up the street. The 2 outside bombers dropped their bombs on either side of our house, blew up the gardens and the lawns on each side of it. The centre lead bomber, each one of them dropped 5 bombs. The lead bomber dropped 2 bombs on one side of the house, blew up the garden and everything else, and 2 bombs immediately beyond the house, and the 5th bomb hit the ground at the base of the wall of the house and went under the house, under the very room that the 3 generals were meeting in, and it didn't explode.
Mm.
It was absolutely incredible. Mm. If that had exploded, of course, we would never have even found bits of the body. So you've got to be lucky sometimes. But how did the Japanese know that? And another instance of that help that the Japanese got from the Malays at Melawang. That's just a couple of miles inland from Mersing, which is a perfect landing spot, beaches and whatnot. And also, once the enemy got ashore there was a road running straight down into Singapore for their tanks. It was wonderful. And so we had, let's call them lookouts, down there to give advance warning if they saw a landing party coming. And every night we sent a platoon out to check on them. And every night our intelligence officer, Leslie Greener, Captain Leslie Greener, would sit down and he'd think, now what's the password for tonight? And on this occasion, he said, Bondi. So the change of the, let's call them lookouts, and the ones that went out were told the password tonight is Bondi. When the platoon went out to check on all this, they were then told Bondi is the password. So they went out, and of course the usual thing, password, Bondi, right, okay. 15 minutes later, at 6:15, we had our radio going. Tokyo Rose came on the air saying, now you Australian boys at Jamelawang, you be careful tonight with that Bondi password. She said, if you miss it out, you're rightly shot, so be very careful. It obviously, possibly on the first halt, give me the password spot, there had been a Malay in the undergrowth of the jungle, and at that point, somehow or other, he had got back, bonk, bonk, and Tokyo Rose 15 minutes from the time that that password was conjured up in the mind of the intelligence officer. We had Tokyo Rose talking to him about it. No.
Can we move along now to capitulation, and that you settle into a routine of living as a prisoner of war, and come to the point where you were selected as a member of A Force to go to Burma. Would you like to just tell us about your movement to Burma and which port you ended up in up there?
Well, the capitulation was on Sunday the 15th of February, and the general was still, and the time was 8:30 p.m. At 9 o'clock, we were prisoners of war at 8:30 p.m. At 9 o'clock, the general dictated to me an order of the day to go to all the troops, thanking them for their loyalty and their hard work, etc., etc. And so at 9:30, he disappeared with Major Moses and Lieutenant Walker. And so we were in, at that time, in Tanglin Barracks. We'd taken over a section of that. And all the rifles and other gear that we had to be collected, and the Japs came in, and that was a surprise to us. They were small and they were practically ragged. Their breeches would have patches in them. And we thought, well, crikey, but they'd beaten us, so, you know. So 2 or 3 days later we got the orders to go to Changi, and so we moved into Changi, and that was an 18-mile march. It was hardly a march, it was a straggle. But that was, and we were in Changi. And if I can go back to the assistance that the Japanese got from the local people in Malaya, in Malaya there were dance halls. One at Malacca, 2 in Singapore, the Happy World and the Great World, and the manager of the Malacca dance hall was very friendly, and he, particularly to us, and there was a camp near him, and he was terribly friendly, and he used to slip us free tickets. He bought a ticket for 10 cents for a dance, and he used to, oh, he was very, very helpful. We'd been in Changi for about 3 days, and in he walked in the uniform of a captain in the Imperial Japanese Army. And there he'd been for possibly years, gathering information. That's going back to the Malays and their assistance of the Japanese.
That's very interesting.
But we were in Changi in the early couple of months. I found it well, it was depressing for a start. We were prisoners, and I thought anything to get out of this. So when the Japanese called for a party of 3,000 men, because the reason was given that food was running short in Singapore, and so 3,000 men were going somewhere where there was plenty of food and conditions were wonderful. So our High Command, which the commander was
Blackjack.
Lieutenant Colonel Galligan. And this brings up another point, that the argument that Bennett should have stayed and looked after and helped his men is absolutely stupidity, because every officer of the rank of colonel and above was segregated from the troops, and they finished up not only in Singapore, they finished up in Manchuria. So if Bennett had stayed there, he could not have done a single thing for the troops, because he was segregated and made part of impossible. But the 3,000 men, Galligan, I think it was Galligan's idea, they made it into what I would call a mini division. There were headquarters, the artillery and the engineers and all the other bits and pieces, with the idea that if the Allies could ever get to us and drop us material, arms and ammunition and whatnot, we could operate as a mini thing. Well, we left, and of course the rumours were rife. We were going to be swapped with three prisoners of war for 1 sheep. We were going to go to Portuguese territory, which was neutral at that time. Wonderful rumours were, some of them were quite feasible. But we, on the ship, Toyahasi Maru, and we went down the channel out of Keppel Harbour and of course it's marked by buoys. Starts with 8, 7, 6, 5 down to 1, and everybody was hanging over down to 1. Now, did we go south to Portuguese territory or somewhere, or did we go further up there? And of course we turned to starboard and up we went. And our idea of a mini division was blown to pieces. The Japanese stopped at Victoria Point, which is the lowest point in Burma. It's near where Kingsford Smith was supposed to have lost his life. But they unloaded 1,000 men. And then 2 days later we were off Magui, and another 1,000 men were sent off. 2 days later we were in Tavoy. And the typical Japanese, it was a howling typhoon when we got into Tavoy. The ship was rolling madly. They threw landing nets over, and everybody that was being sent ashore, which was the rest of us, had to climb down those, and they had unloaded some landing craft and get into those. Well, the ship was rolling, and they had put down a galley, what do you call it, footway down.
Gangway?
Gangway down the side of the ship.
Gangplank.
And our officers asked, begged and prayed the Japanese to pull the landing craft into the bottom of the gangway and go down and this. And luckily nobody got badly injured with this tossing and turning. And by that time, because it took a lot longer than the Japs thought, it was night time, so they stopped there. I was in the party, fortunately. Oh, and that was wonderful to be able to stretch out before we were crowded together. And the next, of course, the storm blew itself out in the night time. Sea was as flat as a pancake in the next morning, and we were all ordered to go down the gangway into the ships. And then we went ashore, and then we marched out to Tavoy, which is about 12 miles, I think. And it was interesting that the Burmese were very helpful, and they gave us a bit of money. They'd rush in and they'd give us fruit and all sorts of things, and the Japs bashed them, and while the Japs were bashing the Burmese down here, another one was up in the front there handing out fruit and food. They were very, very helpful. Then we got to Tavoy Airport, which the British had commenced building, but had only got as far as the walls and ceiling and nothing else. And we were lined up outside and counted again. Japanese were great on counting. Every man had to be accounted for. And then we were told to go into the, it was about midnight, into the big hangar. And of course, the floor was made up in the early stages of being built by great jagged rock. It was not a smooth place, and so nobody got any sleep that night. And then later on, we were moved into the huts that the British, or the RAF had built for their men, and we moved into those, and then commenced completing the runways.
Yes.
And the rains started, and they came, monsoon rains. You could see them coming in a moving curtain of water. Incredible, we weren't used to monsoon rains like that. And we would fill in to extend the end of the runway, dig earth from way over the side, haul it back and fill it in to extend. And every night when we knocked off, the Jap very carefully supervised the building of a little wall around our new bus so that the rain would run down and not touch what we had just done that day.
Yes.
And it was very odd. Every night they'd knock off and they'd get practically right to the edge of the aerodrome, and the bloke would say to the Jap foreman, oh, and he'd point to, because the language was, we had no Japanese and they had no English, and he'd point to a water bottle or something, and he said, mine, me, all sign language, he had left his behind there. Could he go and get all of them? So he went back and very carefully kicked out one section of the wall and picked up his carefully left water bottle or what have you, and came back and kicked another section out, so that the next morning, with the rain that night, the next morning all our freshly laid earth was gone. So that held things up. And you talk about psychic. When it was finished, finally finished, about 3 or 4 months, and along the beginning of the airstrip, there was we had dug a big ditch to take the water from there. The first plane that came in, he circled around and had a look at it, and every POW there said, crash you bastard, crash you bastard, and he promptly did. He landed a few feet short, but he landed in the
ditch.
The ditch that he wouldn't have noticed it from the air. But he landed in that, and of course up in the air he went and crashed down. We heard later on that he committed suicide in Tavoy because he had destroyed some of the Emperor's
Property.
aircraft, but that was Tavoy. And then when that was finished, we went down and picked up a small ship and went up to Moulmein, and from Moulmein we went by train down to Tambazayat, and Tambazayat became the base camp commencement of the Burma-Thailand Railway. And we were there for a couple of days where we listened to a long speech translated for us by another Jap. How lucky we were to this wonderful project that would help the whole world. We should have been pleased to have been involved in such a wonderful undertaking. So out we went then, and the same thing, to build the embankment, you dug earth 40 yards away and carried it by what we call the bag and pole. It was a rice bag attached to a pole, and so you'd lay the thing flat in the ground, somebody would fill it with earth, and 2 men would pick it up with the bamboo rod over their shoulder and get it onto the embankment and tip it out, and somebody else. And so the embankment was usually about 4 or 5 foot high, and that became later on
The rail bed.
what they laid the sleepers and the rails on.
And in your own case, what sort of clothing did you have at this stage and footwear?
Well, very little of either of them, and with the constant sweat and no soap to wash things properly, shirts and shorts, socks and things, they wore out so quickly that, and boots were the same. we were reduced to, if you were lucky, you had a second shirt and a second pair of trousers to put on dry when you came in. But our equipment was very meagre, and the Japanese never gave us anything. And this was even more so when we got to Japan in Omuta. We had a hospital there with the chief was an American doctor, and the Australian doctor in the group was Dr. Ian Duncan, and they had nothing. Malaria cases, no, and they begged the Japanese to give them medical supplies. Didn't have it. They didn't have it, so couldn't get it. And at times they would, for 100 men in hospital desperately ill, they'd get a handful of pills of some description, but nothing more. Absolutely nothing. Clothing simply wore out. In the mine it wore out, and you tied the remnants of a shoe or a boot on, tied it on with string or wire, whatever you could get hold of, because the Japanese had absolutely nothing. When the war ended, on this point, when the war ended and we were informed, that's another story, we ordered the Japs out of the camp, and they went. And one of our chaps said, well, down in the Jap section of the camp, there's a hut, and the door is locked and barred and chained. There must be something interesting in it. So we went, all right. So somebody got a crowbar and we went down, bashed it open, and that hut, 100 yards long, big hut, was jam-packed from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with clothing from the International Red Cross.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely jam-packed, and yet nobody got a thing. And at the same time, this chap said, oh, wait a minute. He said, over at the mine, on the, we called it the first level, which is 50 feet down, not down, way down 2,000 feet. He said there's a section of a tunnel there that also has this incredible gateway, barred and locked and chained. Oh, so over he went, and I felt sorry for the doctors, because in that hut, in that tunnel, 8 foot wide, 8 foot high, was every imaginable medication that they had been asking for. Sent by the International Red Cross, and instead of being for us, but instead of being given to us, it was locked away in there.
Incredible. Thank you, Roy. Now, I'm aware that when you were working on the Burma end of the line, that you were working closely with Rolly Richards.
Yes.
And you've covered that very extensively in your book, and Rolly's also covered it in his book. But at one stage, Rolly had a change. He was given a rest from being with the mobile team, and Major John Chalmers came up to work there. Can you tell us anything about him?
Well, Rolly had literally worked himself almost to death by working all day with the sick in camp, and when he could have been asleep at night, he would consider every man in camp and their character, their psychology, and so that when a man came up before him, perhaps with the onset of malaria, say, Rolly knew that that man was a battler and could be, and another man would come up and Rowley knew that he was a shirker. He needed, you know, looking after. He knew and he had, with that sort of thing, and I think the Japanese recognised that he was on his last legs, and he was keeping more men out on the line by his medical work, so they didn't want him to die. So they sent him back to the 30 kilo camp, which was a hospital camp, and he spent I think 3 or 4 weeks there, which put him back on his feet. And in his place, Major Chalmers came out from Tambazite, where he'd been in the big base camp, big hospital there, and he had no conception of what the jungle camps were like, and what the guards and Japanese transport people were like. You only had to blink and you got bashed. And this absolutely threw John Chalmers, but to give him all credit, he pulled himself together and he did quite a good job. But he was very thankful, obviously very thankful, when Rowley came back to camp and he could get back to the comforts of Tambazite base. But he was a good doctor, and he was with us, of course, when we went back to Singapore from Phnom Penh, and he went off in the Japan party and lost his life when the Rakuya Maru was sunk.
Yes. Because
he was in with 2 or 3 lifeboats from the ship that the Japanese had left behind. And another destroyer came up and simply lowered their 4-inch guns and their machine guns and blew that Brigadier Valdi's party with Chalmers in it, killed a lot of them.
Yes.
And Rowley Richards was lucky. He was far enough away from that episode, and then he saw a Japanese destroyer coming up. Well, that was going to be the same thing, so they all shook hands with each other in the boat, and to their surprise, the destroyer eased off and pulled up beside them, and then took them aboard. It must have been one of the few reasonable Japanese Navy captains in the whole Japanese Navy. And then they landed them at Formosa, and they were put into another ship, and finally got up to Japan and went to Sakata, where they were, his party, I forget now what, they weren't coal mining, it might have been the steelworks or something there. But they were up there.
And was it correct? Was he the only Aussie in that party, or?
Oh no.
Went through to Sakata?
No.
No.
No, there was quite a number. It was only, well, the split up. The survivors, you see, were a couple of lifeboats full of men. So there would only be 40 or 50 Australians. The rest that were up in Sakata with him were British.
Yes.
And they took it very poorly that Rowley, when the war ended, Rowley celebrated that with his men. The British officers got themselves, they were separated. They couldn't mix with the other ranks. The British have an incredible social status in, if you're an officer, you are something away and beyond your other ranks.
Yes. Now, if we can go back now to when you finished working on the Burma End of the Line. Do you remember which camp you were in when you got on the train to go down to Thailand?
we were over the border, and we were into Thailand. See, in those days, the camps didn't have names.
No.
They were just known as the
Number of kilos.
number so-and-so kilo camp.
Yeah.
And I think that camp that we were in was the 133rd
Yes.
kilo camp.
Yeah.
And we went down by train to Tamarkan. And that was a nervy run because we had sabotage when we could get away with it was number one. And we knew that the chaps on the Thailand side, when they built bridges, if they had two pieces with a great bolt through them, well, when the Jap wasn't watching and they could get away with it, that had a head on it and a tail on it, but nothing in the middle. And we held our breath on some of those bridges, knowing that they could fall apart.
Yes.
Anyway, we got to Tamarkan, and that was that was wonderful. One of a mate of mine from my unit saw me. He said, "Oh, I didn't recognise you at first. I must have looked a bit gaunt, weighed 5 stone, with malaria or everything else." And he said, "Oh, it's a pity." He said, he said, "Tomorrow is a no-meat day." I said, "Well, big deal." I said, "The last time I had any meat must have been 2.5 years ago." So he said, "Yes, but," he said, "when they don't supply any meat, they double the supply of eggs." And I said, "Eggs?" I said, "The last time I had a stinking egg was in Tavoy, and that's two years ago or more." He said, "Well, they bring in enough eggs, half of them go into the kitchen, into the soup and whatnot, and every man in camp gets an egg." Oh, I said, "This is wonderful." And so that was the time we spent there, 2 or 3 months, put me back on my feet, and all the rest of us too, from up on the line. And then the Japanese decided that they wanted to form a Japan party, a party to go to Japan. And my mate, close mate, Morris Barclay, we discussed this very carefully, and we finally came to the conclusion that it would be a good thing to join the Japan party, because it was difficult. For some unknown reason, if you had bad ulcer scars on your legs, the Japs knocked you off. We had, both of us had very bad scars. But Morris had a mate in the orderly room, and so we decided to go to Japan. We would get out of the tropics. That may ease, if not get rid of, malaria. Japan would be, there would be international Red Cross people, neutral diplomatic people. The camps must be headed by senior army personnel, which would be better than the Korean and third-class Japanese privates that, you know, you only had to blink and you got a bashing. It must be better all over. So, fortunately, with Morris's mate in the orderly room, 2 men suddenly went down with malaria the day before the first section of the Japan party was to move out, and so their names were rubbed out and our names were put in. So we went to Japan, which meant trained in a Kompatan, and then from there, by train, in terribly cramped conditions, as usual, up to Phnom Penh.
Yes.
On the Mekong River, and by boat down the Mekong River. And the Mekong was a surprise to me and everybody else. At that point, it's 12 miles wide.
Mm.
And if you're close in on one bank, you can't see the other bank. The curvature of the earth, you didn't see it. We went down and then transferred into a little river that took us into Saigon, and we went into Saigon. And the first party, was actually on a ship when they were about faced and brought back into camp. And the reason was, which is most unusual for Japanese, every boat that left the wharf in Saigon, it went a wiggle down the river to the open sea. And when it got to the open sea, it was sunk by aircraft from India. And it wasn't until after the war that we learned that, you see, the French in Saigon just continued their
existence
thing, because they had said to the Japanese, we're all Vichy French, Vichy, you see, and they're friendly with Germany and Germany's friendly with it, so that makes us all, well, it's obvious. So they just carried on without any problem. The chief of police, the French chief of police, had a radio, well and truly hidden away, and every time a ship left the wharf at Saigon, he got onto his radio, finish. That was enough, picked up in India, and it took exactly the same time for the aircraft from India to arrive at the mouth of the Saigon River, and the ship went right there.
Yes.
And when we went, finally, it's a long story, well, from Saigon, we went back up the river to Phnom Penh, and then by train down to Singapore.
Now, just before we pause there, Roy, you told us that you'd gone back to Singapore, and it's on record that you were in the party which moved to Japan in the Awa Maru.
That's right.
And that you arrived in Japan sometime in December 1944, which is the coldest winter that they'd had for a long time. And
yes.
The Japs became generous for a change. Can you just briefly tell us what they did?
Well, all they did was to give us army greatcoats, British Army greatcoats, obviously spoils of war from Singapore, and they gave us a British jacket. Well, that seemed all right, but it was hopeless, pardon me, because they're not airtight, they're not airproof. So that unless you've got warm underclothes, those things are useless. The cold air just goes straight through them. But the greatcoats were a great help, and they were issued, and with typical Japanese thing, the 1st of May was the beginning of summer. So no matter what the weather was like, on the 1st of May, every greatcoat was handed in. And it was actually snowing that day. The winter was lingering on. It was the worst winter that, well, some said the worst winter in 70 years. Other authorities said it was the worst winter that Japan had ever endured. But so for 3 or 4 days, we, huddled in the sun, before we went to work, because it was so cold, and the overcoats had been withdrawn. But then summer came and everything was all right. But Muta was a difficult camp. Morris and I, the only thing we were right about was that we got out of the tropics, straight out of the tropics into 4 inches of snow. So that was a bit of a shock to the system. But the guards were absolutely shocking. The rules and regulations for every minute, that you could not go for 5 minutes without breaking a rule regulation. And what they did, some of them, they would hide. You weren't allowed to move around at night, and they would hide. And in the daytime you had to salute and bow to every guard, and they used to hide round the corner of a hut, and if you went past them, they'd go out and say, no salute, no, bang, bang, bang. And in the case of in the winter time, David Runge, an Australian boy, he was unfortunately overheard by a Jap who understood English. He told our newcomers the idea, he said, for goodness sake, don't try and work too hard. He said, you'll kill yourself. But the thing is, you keep moving. He said, that's what the Japs like, you keep moving. Well, that was overheard and understood by a Jap. He was passed over, and for some reason, at the Mitsui mine, there were 2 or 3 Kempi Thai always on duty. What for, I don't know. But he was passed over to them. They bashed the daylights out of him. They brought him back into camp. They knelt him down on the concrete floor in front of the guardhouse and wouldn't let him up. And our doctors went to the Japanese Camp Sergeant Major and pointed out that kneeling like that was restricting the flow of blood, and he would get gangrene in his legs. That didn't make any difference to anybody. And it finished up that when they did release him, he went straight over to the hospital and had to have both legs amputated just below the knee.
And who actually did the amputation, do you know?
Well, Ian Duncan.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh.
And David Runge and you and Ian were, yes, you and Ian Duncan, you and Runge were close friends after the war.
Well,
right?
Yes, particularly Ian Duncan. We became very, very friendly, and I learned an awful lot, you know, of what had gone on in his area that I didn't know about. And I was referred to as one of the family. He lives at Five Dock in Sydney. He died in 1970 something, and every now and then I have lunch with his widow, who is a very hard worker for charities and Red Cross and goodness only knows what not. She does a wonderful job.
Yes. There were some, you were talking about how bad the Japs and the Koreans were, the guards, but the behaviour of some of the Americans, and I'm told that there was a Commander Little and a Sergeant Benito that made life difficult for...
Yes, they were simply pro-Japanese, and they were responsible for the deaths of several men that they, for some reason or other, they would put them in, instead of disciplining them in their own lines, they put them into the Japanese, and in that case several lost their lives. And Squashy Little, Squashy in Japanese is small, and he was only a short man, but he was a shocking animal. And when the war ended and the Allied troops came in, he was handed over to them and he went off under an armed guard. And apparently he must have had a good story or something, because all that happened to him he should have been hung, or should have been hanged. But all that happened to him, he had a dishonourable discharge.
Mm.
And the other chap was a sergeant. We called him Goshi, we called him Gojuichi because that was his number, 51. That was Bennett. Sometimes you see him as Bennett and other times as Benito.
Mm.
But he was as bad as little as being pro-Japanese.
Mm.
And he was thoroughly hated by every man in camp, and they tried to get him a couple of times, and on one occasion he was in charge of a group lining up or filling railway trucks outside the camp, and they had to bring trucks down and couple them up, and they noticed that he was taking his ease in between the buffers of the truck, and so the blokes up which were pushing a truck down said, "Quick, if we're quick enough we'll get him." And so they put all their strength into it, and down came that truck. And Gojuichi saw it coming at literally the last few seconds, and he dived out, and to push himself out further, he put his hand on the buffer, and very neatly took his thumb off, or his right hand, and he went into hospital and they stitched the stump up, well, no stump, stitched it up, and he then was proud of that. He said, and I was there when he said it in one group, he said, now, he said, I'm, without that thumb, he said, I can salute properly as a Japanese because they don't, he said, now I can do it because I've got a...
Really?
So he was an awful man. But you get all types in the army.
Now, you know, we had a person who became a distinguished politician after the war in the form of Tom Uren. He was in that camp too, was he?
Yeah, but I didn't know him. See, in the camp it was very difficult because there were 100 of us, there were 500 in the party, and each 100 was in different huts. Your best mate might be in the next hut, but you'd be out at work and he'd be back in camp, and he'd be out at work. You never met.
Yes.
Morris and I were very, very lucky because our numbers weren't running together. But what the Japanese recognised that Australians particularly formed groups, and they didn't like that. So a day or so after we got into Omuta, we were all lined up by number. And what they did then, right, the first man went into the first hut, the second man went into the second hut, third man into the fourth hut, and so on. So and actually Morris was in another hut, and when the numbers were reallocated, he became 1479 and I was 1477.
Yes.
So we're in not only in the same hut, we're in the same room.
Yes.
So, which was a wonderful thing until we lost him with pneumonia
And that was in 45. Had he been ill for a long time? Or was it sudden?
He had pneumonia, and he beat that finally. But see, the Japanese doctor, we afterwards found out that he was a second-year dental student, but he had the power of life and death. If you could stand up, you went out to work. if you had a gash on the arm, oh, that was something you could say, oh, you got a day off. If it was bad enough, you got 2 days off. But double pneumonia, he couldn't see that, so he went out to work. And as soon as you got out of hospital from pneumonia, as in Morris Barclay's case, you got about 2 days rest in camp, and then you were out to work.
Yes.
So, you know, Morris was practically carried to and fro work, and then the second time he got pneumonia again. And what the medical orderlies in the hospital told me, that one of them said, well, he had the pneumonia beaten, but he said all the beriberi and palaga and whatnot in Thailand and Burma, his heart gave way this morning.
Yeah.
So I lost my best mate.
Yes. And he was an academic, was he? Or...
He was a Bachelor of Arts with honours from the University of Sydney. He spoke and wrote and had no problem with French and German languages. He was an authority, let's call it an authority on prehistory, Egyptian pharaohs and whatnot. There was nothing. He was a beautiful pianist, a wonderful pianist. He had already got his first licentiate or whatever they call it in the Conservatorium of Music. Beautiful pianist, and terrible loss. I still feel his loss.
I'm sure you do, yes. Now, do you remember the day that the war ended, or your first knowledge that the war was over?
Yeah, that came slowly. I was on night shift, and I was asleep during the daytime, and in the afternoon I was woken up, and some of the others were too. There was a lot of chatter going on out in the hallway of the hut, and Bruce Strange, who was not exactly a mate of mine, but we worked together, he went mad, and he said, you so-and-so's, you know, we'll be out to work tonight, and you're stopping us sleeping now. And somebody said, no, there's something up. There's the day party. See, there was the 3 shifts, and then there was a permanent day party that did renovations and whatnot in the mine. He said they brought them in, and he said there's talk that the farm party is coming in, and there's also a rumour that the night shift is not going out tonight. So we don't know what's going on. But good old Ned Coulter, he said, oh, the war's over. I tell you, the war's over. And I said, well, don't let's get too anxious about that, because I said the guard's been doubled. And with every guard, there was a young chap armed with a long bamboo pointed spear. And I said, why would they double the guard if the war's over? And it happened that way. Nobody went out to work. But everything else carried on for the next couple of days in the camp. The guards were still there, but we just didn't go to work. And we got issued, for the first time, a few bits and pieces from Red Cross Basel. Now, I was in the army for 6 years, and I was a POW for three and a half. I have never seen a Red Cross Basel.
Wow.
Because they came into the camp, and the Japs simply put them away, and they would give tiny bits out now and then. And on this occasion, we had got some cheese, and in my Dixie I had a couple of tiny cubes of cheese. And I went from my hut round to the it was meal time, the second or third day, to the mess hall, and I passed the guard and I saluted him as required, and he pointed to my Dixie and said, "Give me that." And I said, "No, you bastard, it's mine, I want it." And it took me a couple of paces before I realised, you can't speak to a guard like that. I thought, and that's 4 days to kill you with a thing like that. And yet the shout of "you" didn't come. I thought, the war's over. The guard might be there, but they're impotent. They are simply there. And that next day, I got into the mess hall. Oh, my legs were trembling, but my heart was singing. I knew that the war was over. But how it was, you see, whether we'd be repatriated by the Japanese, what was going, we didn't know. And the next day, we're all paraded again, and the camp commandant, Fukuhara, read out a long speech to say that the Emperor had acceded to the demands of the Allied forces.
3 minutes. Yeah.
Well, what are we to do with that?
Well, the war was over. Did your food improve
No.
suddenly? No. And how many days or weeks was it before you moved from Omuta?
Well, that was about 5 or 6 weeks, because the Allies had drawn a line across Japan and had decided, for some reason, to occupy the northern part first. And they considered that there would be terrible opposition from what was left of the army and the civilian population. So they took the procedure of a normal landing into enemy territory. So they put a thing in, put a line round, another second would come in, put a line round, and they would disregard the fact that the population was there clapping their hands to see them, because the Emperor had said, those who were our enemies are now our friends. And that, if the Emperor said that, well, that's what it was.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we had but that took a long time before they got down to the south of Kyushu to come into our camp. But by that time, it was quite amazing. A chap from the Perth, the signals man from the Perth, absolute genius, he had picked up Chungking radio on bits and pieces that he'd put together. And I was with him because he said, "You write shorthand, and if we get anything, you can take it all down."
Do you remember his name?
No, I can't remember
fine.
his name. And absolutely miraculously, he had all this, it looked like a Heath Robinson, and there were wires running everywhere. There were bits and pieces, but he had a genius. He'd put together this thing, and one day I was sitting there on the ground, of course, and he was fiddling, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "There's a station here." He said, "I can feel it." He said, "There's a station." And a minute or two later, booming into the room came the voice, "This is the voice of freedom. This is Chungking radio." He'd not only miraculously picked up the station, but he'd picked it up, of course, over in Western China, they were, I think, 2 or perhaps even 3 hours time lapse between us and them. He picked up the very instant that they had opened their morning radio.
Broadcast. I'm going to have to stop you there, but and I'm going to have to. Want to record my gratitude to you for giving us this talk, because it's really a very valuable.